Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. The book, Day of Honey, is, as it says on its cover, a memoir of food, love, and war. I know that sounds an unlikely combination, but that's how the journalist, Annia Ciezadlo, beautifully describes the 6 years she recently spent in the Middle East, and she is my guest. Did you really spend your honeymoon in Baghdad?
I did. I did. We did, my husband and I. He's a journalist, and so he had been posted to Baghdad. And I had spent so much time with him in Iraq during the run-up to the Iraq War, sitting by the phone, wondering if he was okay, that I just decided, you know what? I'm just going to go with.
What did he say?
It was an interesting reaction. I mean, I think he wanted to encourage me to do it. I think he was happy that I wanted to do it. At the same time, there was just a lot of things to worry about.
I can imagine. He was then he was the foreign correspondent for Newsday in this.
He was the Middle East bureau chief for Newsday.
And you were centered in Lebanon.
We were based in Lebanon, Beirut. But we were almost never there.
Yeah. Those days. So what was it like to arrive there for the first time? I can't imagine what it. I always wonder what it's like to come to New York for the first time.
Right.
But to go to Iraq during the war.
It was, it's hard to describe those days. I mean, it was one of the hardest things for me to write in the book because everything is so different now. This was the fall of 2003, and it was exciting. People were, and I don't mean exciting like in the bang bang, you know, it's exciting way, but exciting, there was this sense of hope and of movement and of change.
Really?
People were really happy. People really thought that they were going to get a democracy. It was something they had been dreaming of for 35 years. And so there was a sense of fear and uncertainty, but there was also this very real sense of hope.
There wasn't a tension between the Shiites and the Sunnis? Or is that just a part of life in the Middle East?
It's interesting. A lot of what I write in the book is sort of trying to describe these transitions and the way I try to write about everyday life and sort of the texture and the feeling of everyday life. When I first got to Baghdad, Sunni Shiite tension was there. Like, it would be naive to say that it's not there, but it was there the way racial tension is here in America. It was something that only occasionally was a huge problem, and it was something that can be exacerbated by events, but it hadn't been, you know, it wasn't a civil war at that point.
I know, you know, when they always talked about crime in New York City, I never quite felt it the same way.
Right.
So I'm assuming that was the same way. We lived here. It sort of went someplace else, but when it's reported in the papers, because it's always reported, then you always get those incidents beyond, as you said, ordinary life.
Well, here's something that I think I've read a lot of books about civil wars, and here and you know, in Iraq and everywhere. We tend to think of civil wars as being something that are sort of innate to particular countries, like the Lebanese Civil War. We think, oh, well, you know, they're just that way, ancient ethnic hatreds. They have these sectarian rivalries. Civil wars are almost always created specifically and deliberately. And it can be by a neighboring country, it could be by a political faction, it could be by a group like Al-Qaeda, as it was in Iraq. And so it was the time that Mohammed and I were in Iraq was this time when civil war didn't really need to have happened. And so seeing it being created deliberately by these strategies of killing people based on sect and these strategies of provocation was a really heartbreaking, awful thing.
Who did that?
In the beginning, it was mostly Al-Qaeda related stuff. You know, there would be these cases where Shiites would be kidnapped and brutally tortured, and then their bodies would be photographed and dumped and things like this. Very, very deliberate, very strategic provocation, and it worked. And Shiites started doing the same thing to Sunnis, and you know, these strategies are very effective. They worked in the Balkans. They work, you know, they work pretty much anywhere in the world.
They worked in the United States, didn't they? We had one of the biggest.
In our Civil War, yeah. It's funny because every once in a while Iraqis would ask me, you know, do you think that America would have a civil war? And I would say, we had one.
United States of America,
it was very ugly and very nasty, and we had it. And
it's the same way now with the revolution, too.
Yeah.
I mean, people are increasingly, every once in a while you hear, well, you had a revolution.
Yeah.
With 17 people or however many it was.
Exactly.
So it's very, so the adage, history repeats itself is really true. But you went behind all the war scenes.
Yeah.
And you deliberately, you're a person who loves neighborhoods.
I love neighborhoods, and it was funny because I always tell people I never wanted to be a foreign correspondent. It was never my aim. My aim was always to write about New York City or urban politics and urban affairs.
So you were already a writer when you went.
I was already a journalist. I had been working for a magazine called City Limits that wrote about sort of bread and butter neighborhood stuff in New York, like housing and schools, waterfront development, kind of wonky stuff like that, but like subways, taxi drivers, things like this. And I liked the idea of writing about that kind of bread and butter stuff, everyday stuff in Baghdad, because everyone was focusing on the militants and the politicians and all this kind of stuff. And I said, well, what about hospitals? What about things like parents being able to send their kids to school, which is a huge issue for anyone who's a parent, which most people are, and something that I felt like it wasn't getting enough attention. It's something I felt like American readers would be really, really interested in.
Well, I think they are. And food. I mean, how do you eat? Now, you've always liked food also.
I have always been kind of an unapologetic eater.
Where you grew up in Chicago? In a neighborhood?
Actually not in a neighborhood. No. It's interesting. It's kind of suburban where my family lives. But it was one of these interesting things where there was a Greek family, like a big Greek family, and this will explain why I felt so at home in the Middle East. And my grandmother moved to one part of this suburban area outside of Chicago, and then all of my aunts and uncles, like all of her sisters and brothers, lived like within a few blocks. Yeah. Well, not all of them. Some of them lived in Florida, but it was like very much the kind of situation you'd find in Lebanon or in Beirut or Baghdad.
Yeah, with the whole clan.
The whole clan, and they would have like grape arbors in the backyard and stuff like that.
Yeah. So. What's the ethnic background?
Greek, Polish, and Scotch-Irish. These are the Greeks who all moved within a couple of blocks of each other.
It's an interesting combination. So when you went to Baghdad, you started looking. You lived in a hotel?
Yeah. It wasn't, at that time, it wasn't really wise to rent an apartment. Yeah. And so there were these little hotels, and some of them were very big, and those were like where CNN and the AP and all those places stayed. And then the big newspapers, like the New York Times and the Washington Post, they would have their own houses. They would like rent these massive villas and have like staff and groundskeepers and stuff like that.
And Newsday didn't have.
And Newsday didn't do that. No. Mohammed and I tried to keep our operations like very sort of low to the ground, very easy to move if you need to. I think this comes from him being Lebanese and growing up during the Lebanese Civil War, and always having this sense of like, let's keep our passports in the back pocket and keep a suitcase by the door in case we have to leave.
And he doesn't offer he's not offering a lot of information or talk.
He's exactly the opposite of me in that way. Yeah.
And that is the conditioning from how he grew up. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because he grew up in Beirut.
He grew up in Beirut during the Civil War.
And his family is still in Beirut. His mother is still his father at the time. And all the aunts and uncles are around him.
Yeah.
So you lived in a hotel, and you got to be friendly with all these people, right? None of the high officials.
We made a deliberate effort not to hang out too much with other journalists, and not to hang out too much with, like, I don't know, the sort of embassy politics, like the sort of official crowd, the usual suspects. I mean, we did get to know some Iraqi politicians. One of them is a female Iraqi politician that I write about in the book. But we made a really deliberate attempt to get to know a lot of just ordinary Iraqis and Iraqi people. And it helped because we had a couple of Lebanese journalist friends who already knew a bunch of Iraqis, so we just kind of...
Did you feel comfortable right away with the people?
It did. Yeah. It did, actually. It was interesting.
It comes across in the book that it's as if you were talking to friends someplace else.
Most people in Iraq at that time were very happy to meet somebody from another country because Iraq had been so closed off from the rest of the world.
Were they interested in Americans, or did they like them?
They were fascinated. Some people had some interesting ideas and misconceptions, but for the most part, most people were not too hostile. People were very cagey, and they were distrustful. They were suspicious, and they tended to think that Americans might be out to get them. Just, I think, mostly as a product of the conditioning they'd been getting from, you know, Saddam media. And look, there was also just a mood of paranoia in the country after 35 years of that being just drummed into them.
Yeah.
In the book, I quote from a speech that Saddam Hussein gave in 1977 to the Ministry of Education. And he said, beware of the foreigner, because the foreigners are agents who are out to sabotage our revolution. And this message they'd been getting since then pretty relentlessly. So people were always sort of, you know, not sure if you could be trusted. At the same time, they were very curious and very interested.
Yeah. Did they, were the women independent?
Yeah.
So were you surprised at the strength they had?
Absolutely the strength. I mean, really, really at how strong and how resourceful Iraqi women were. I think we tend to get this sort of distorted view of Middle Eastern women, that they're all just these sort of helpless women who've been wrapped in burqas and stuffed in a hole somewhere. Iraqi women were the first women in the Middle East to get the vote in 1948. And it was the first Arab country to have a cabinet minister in 1959. And there was always a large percentage of women in the workforce, particularly as public servants and civil servants in jobs like that, teachers, things like that.
And what did they wear? Did they just wear regular clothes?
Completely depended. It depended on what religion they were, what neighborhood they were, how traditional their family was. You would see in some parts of Baghdad, you would see women wearing halter tops and makeup and like lots of makeup.
Where did they come from?
That would be sort of an exceptional case. In the fall of 2003, though, you could still see that. You could see, you know, teenage girls walking down the street in like a raspberry pink halter top. I remember seeing that and thinking, wow, this is not exactly
what you thought.
The image that you get in the Western media.
Yeah.
And, you know, and meanwhile, there's a woman with an abaya, and, you know, and it's just sort of, that's just how it is. An abaya? I have to answer this question a lot. Everyone gets confused because they think that women in Iraq wear burqas, which they don't. That's Afghanistan, which isn't even in the Middle East, really. An abaya it's an Arabic word that means robe, and so it can mean different things depending on context. In the context of Iraqi women, it's this sort of cloak. It's like this black cloak, and you wear it, kind of goes over the top of your head. So you might wear a headscarf underneath, and then you'd wear this thing, and it just kind of goes over your head and then all the way down. And sometimes you pin it, although often I would see women holding it and trying to do like 5 other things with their other hand at the same time.
So they wear that in public?
Some women wear that in public, not all women.
And what women?
Totally depends.
Can you tell is Shiite, Sunni, or anything like that, or you can't really tell?
You can
it's
tell.
It's just more of a tradition?
Yeah, it's a traditional thing. Look, I think a lot of these things, with a lot of these sort of headscarves and coverings and all these things, you can't generalize about it too much because it's different from country to country. It's different from maybe even neighborhood to neighborhood.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Did the Shiites mostly live in one neighborhood and Sunnis in another, or
when
another?
When I first got there, there were a lot of mixed neighborhoods. There were a lot of very mixed neighborhoods.
Are there now?
No.
No.
And that's what civil wars do.
Yeah. And friends were really torn apart.
Yeah. Friends, sometimes couples. There was a lot of intermarriage in Iraq, contrast to Lebanon, where intermarriage is not common at all.
Yeah.
Iraq had civil marriage, and I think that has something to do with it when you have a history of civil marriage. I think.
So, but you're also writing about food because you've got wonderful descriptions of food and even recipes in the back. It's so great. So you started going around to markets. How did you cook in a hotel room?
I decided to write about food because it was something that I was just personally, when I first got to Baghdad, I said, you know, I don't know anything about Iraq. I mean, that's not true. I'd read a couple books, but I didn't, you know, I didn't really know. And so I decided that the way I usually get to know a new place is just to go to the market, to try to find restaurants that I like, to try to find people who will talk to me about food. And there are a couple of strategic reasons for that. One is just that I like food and I like to eat. And I'm kind of always hungry. So it just seemed like a practical thing to do.
But anyway.
And so the other reason is because it's a really good way to sort of break the ice with people that you don't know. And if people were sort of like, hey, what do I do with this American woman and what's she doing here? I could say, hey, you know, how do you make this or how do you make that? And they would sort of forget themselves and forget, you know, any context of I'm American and they're Iraqi or whatever. And they would get really excited about sharing their food.
So great. And then you cooked and you got recipes
Mm-hmm.
and cooked in a hotel, in a hot burner.
The hotels, when we think of hotel, it's funny because I'm sort of not really a hotel type of person. And
you're becoming an expert.
When you're, the hotels in the Middle East they're not the Hilton.
I'm sure.
And the ones that I'm writing about in particular, they're more like furnished rooms. So they do actually have like these little vestigial kitchens. They're almost like where students, they're kind of like dorm rooms a little bit. And so they have like, you know, they might have like a little sink and maybe a little stove, although a lot of them didn't have a little stove. So what we would do is we'd go to the market and for like $25, you get this very cheap like little set of burners that is operated by a propane tank, which you also get from the market. And you set up the propane tank and you set up the burners and you can just cook things on the stovetop. And this was an interesting experience. I found out gradually over time that a lot of people both in Beirut and Baghdad, but especially in Baghdad, they might not be able to afford a full-fledged stove. So they would do a lot of their cooking just on a burner, like on the stovetop, instead of in an oven. So
you both then left. Did you leave together, Baghdad? Yeah.
We did. There was a brief period when I was there on my own, and it was terrifying. But by then I'd spent you know quite a bit of time there, so I sort of knew how to get around and stuff.
And then you went to Beirut. And
Mohammed,
Beirut is a whole different country?
Beirut is a whole different country.
Tell me about Mohammed. Go on.
And Mohammed and I think we thought, you know, look, we'd been through all these eventful times in Baghdad. Things had really gone to hell there, and we'd seen all this violence and strife and you know, just excitement. Like we were there when Saddam was captured, and at the end of 2004, and beginning of 2005, we said, look, okay, you know, the elections are over. We're just going to relax and spend a little quiet time in Beirut. And 2 weeks later, the former prime minister of Lebanon was assassinated, and from then on, things just started to roll. And Lebanon had its peaceful revolution, its peaceful uprising. And so that was, you know, a sequence of events that just kept rolling and rolling.
And how different is Beirut or is Lebanon from Iraq?
It's an interesting question. There are some similarities. It was interesting to see Lebanon having been 15 years from its own civil war, which ended roughly in 1990, at a time when Iraq was really falling into a new civil war. And I always used to tell people, hey, you know, things are not going so bad in Lebanon. If Beirut can recover from this civil war, then Baghdad will be able to make it. And that was, you know, I felt a little differently about that when things started to really get crazy in 2006 and 2007 and 2008. I still believe that to some extent, but it was definitely a lesson in how lasting civil wars can be if you don't take care of them, if you don't have some sort of truth and reconciliation.
It's and you continued to do your cooking and your walking in your neighborhood, and this time though you had a family, Mohammed's family, and it sounds like a wonderful mother-in-law. Behind it all, you just got used to it. But you know, Beirut used to be called, or maybe it's still the Venice of the South, or Venice of.
People call it either the Paris of the Middle East or the Switzerland of the Middle East.
But having gone through these wars, is there a lot of destruction? I mean, when you say it recovered, do you know that there have been wars when you arrive in Beirut? You know,
it's one thing that Iraqis always used to say. And I used to love this. They would say, you know, we need reconstruction of more than just the buildings. We need reconstruction of our minds. This is something Iraqis would say over and over again. And I think it's true of any post-Civil War society, whether it's in the Balkans or whether it's in the US, we had reconstruction, or in the Middle East. And you could see these signs of damage in Beirut, and everyone thinks that, you know, it's very romantic and very picturesque. You have these buildings with gunshots and all these sort of war-damaged buildings, and then right next to them you have these gleaming new towers that they're building. But it was always kind of funny to look at them and think, well, you know, you need to reconstruct
Yeah.
the way people relate to each other.
Do they still have the tension between the Sunnis and the Shiites?
Very much so.
More so, or
Yeah.
as much as Iraq?
Well, I don't know if I would make that comparison, because
Who keeps that going?
Iraq had a raging civil war.
Yeah.
And Lebanon is also, it's only about 5 million people.
Yeah, it's much smaller.
It's much smaller.
Well, we look at the Middle East and all the things that are happening now and the unrest. But you've got the unrest and you've got the revolting of people. But then within them, you've still got
Everyday life.
everyday life. And with that still goes tensions between groups and religions and everything else. Is it ever going to change?
Yeah.
I know you seem to think it's all going to be fine.
I don't think it's all going to be fine, but I don't want to fall into this thing of like, oh, they're just like that and they just keep doing this and they're never going to change. Things can change very easily, as we're seeing now with this wave of revolutions.
Yeah,
Fantastic.
but what I really meant was the Shiites and the Sunnis and the difference between sex.
Civil wars are not innate. Sunnis and Shiites don't have to hate each other, just like blacks and whites.
But is that a result of the Civil War, or does that happen?
It's very deliberate. It's a result of very deliberate, very calculated strategies to create it. And there are many different parties, and you can sort of argue about who the parties are and why they're doing it and how they're doing it. But yeah, you see religious people doing it, and not just Muslim, by the way. Yeah. And you see politicians doing it. You see certainly militia leaders doing it because they know that there's profit in it. Yeah. And civil wars are big business, by the way. A lot of money to be made off of civil wars. Arms dealers, food suppliers, we don't think of this. But, control of food is a huge element in any civil war and in any war, really.
So the young people, it seems to be largely young people, and then older, stronger, people. The young people have lived through wars. And do you think that this is a sign that they're tired of them?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's great because I think what you're seeing now in Egypt and Tunisia and places like that, you're seeing this alliance of young people who are saying, hey, I've grown up with this BS and I don't want to spend the rest of my life dealing with this political situation. And you see partnerships between them and older people who've been fighting for democracy the whole time. Yeah. And so these people are fantastic. I mean, some of these people have been doing this for 30, 40, 50, 60 years. And so it's inspiring to see them finally getting some traction.
What do you think is going to happen in Syria? Syria has what kind of a relationship? How do we describe the relationship between Lebanon and Syria?
Syria was installed with the blessing of Saudi Arabia and the United States as the sort of benevolent babysitter of Lebanon at the end of the Lebanese Civil War. And it was kind of a convenient arrangement for all concerned. It was considered a good way to
protect our oil. Are we?
Not really. No, it's not a question of oil. It was more a question of, oil I think is always sort of an element of any decision in the Middle East. It was more a question of stability. And, stability is sort of the great justification for a lot of supportive dictatorships the world over, but especially in the Middle East. And it was more just a way of sort of ending the conflict and getting it out of the way. And I think this is a real lesson in hey, convenient ways to end conflict will later come on to
They really don't end them.
They'll bite you in the behind eventually.
Yeah. And are they organized and unified by their attitudes towards Israel?
They meaning?
Israel. Well, the countries you mentioned. I mean, Lebanon, Syria, Saudi Arabia.
I think I don't know. I think it tends to be, you tend to find nuances in every different country. I would never generalize about the Middle East. Because I think you have layers and layers and a lot of different, and there's also a difference between what people say and what they really believe. So you need to
That
be
happens
very,
a lot.
Yeah.
Because of the backgrounds and the histories of it, huh?
One of the things I write about in the book, and this is getting back to food, one of the things I discovered in Iraq is that you have this sort of first layer of interaction, and that's what people will tell you when they think they're talking to a journalist. And they'll say, often, depending on who they are, depending on where they're coming from, they'll say, we hate America, we hate Israel, down with everybody, Saddam Hussein is the greatest. Or if they're on the other side, they'll say America, we love America, America's so great. And it tends to be sort of what they think you want to hear. And often it was funny because people would very politely say down with America, we hate Americans, and then they'd be like, do you want some tea or something like that. And then if you spent more time with them, they would finally, and often if you know, it's kind of like the 3 cups of tea thing. If you maybe share a meal or nibble on some pastries or have some tea, they would say, you know, I really don't care about this stuff. Yeah. I just want electricity. Tell the Americans this is the most important thing. And so I learned fairly early on that, you know, what people will say over the dinner table or over a few cups of tea is going to be probably more sincere than if you're just kind of going around and spending 5 minutes here and there with people.
So you've really carved out a wonderful niche for reporting, because everybody else is reporting on battles and statements from leaders and everything else. And you're really going behind and talking to these people. And these revolutions in the different countries are, in fact, I mean, that's your people.
They're, in
and
fact,
you know them better than other people.
It's about, the revolutions are about everyday life.
Yeah.
I mean, the revolutions, when you see people in Tunisia waving baguettes, or people in Yemen, actually, in Yemen, they're baking loaves of bread with the word leave, like get out, actually baked onto the bread and then holding them up in demonstrations. What they're saying is, like, this is what we care about. It's kind of like the electricity. They're saying, like, you know, look, and bread is a symbol of a lot of other things, and particularly in the Middle East, it's got all these kind of deep meanings and resonances, but it's also just a very practical symbol of, like, this is what we care about. You guys aren't providing the basic daily bread, and
that's
you know,
what we want.
Yeah.
So you're going back and you're going to report for us, and we're going to read about it and different things. Are you going to write for the Christian Science Monitor?
You know, it's funny. I've been working on the book for 3.5 years, 4 years actually, and I haven't been writing as much.
Well, I hope you do write, because you've got to tell us what's happening.
I have a Day of Honey Facebook page. You can keep up on that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming. Is there any people you'd like to hear and topics you'd like us to explore? Please let me know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.